Catherine, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. My name is John Colangelo. I'm your facilitator for this afternoon, the least important person in this meeting. I want to thank everyone for attending. The history is we have this NEVI infrastructure project, an August 1st deadline to get a report to the feds on it. Stakeholder engagement is a very important part of this first deadline as well as the whole project. 2 weeks ago, we did an introductory stakeholder meeting. The meeting is posted on a DOT project website, which we'll talk about later on today. We've had two more stakeholder meetings since then to update, to kind of respond to questions in that. This is the third. There's going to be one last stakeholder meeting on July 14th at 2 p.m. And that's to kind of discuss what progress we've made and what this report to the feds are going to be. So when you go on the RIDOT project website in the near future, we'll have information about that July 14th kind of summary stakeholder outreach meeting. What I'd like to do, first things is, this is a public process. This meeting will be recorded, posted on the RIDOT website. If you feel uncomfortable with it, this is a good time to maybe bow out. Everything will be available on the website as well as a way to get your feedback over to this project group. As we go through today, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So interrupt, use the chat feature to ask questions. Ask questions verbally. We really want to get your input. That's the whole goal of these stakeholder meetings. And again, the RIDOT website will have this information coming up. Want to introduce the project team. JP Verducci is our RIDOT project manager. He's the guy that RIDOT puts on all the new technology projects, the things that, you know, are more challenging and interesting. We're glad to have him. Liz Pettengrill is in RIDOT communications. She's been working alongside JP and the project team, making sure we get this information out to people and get their feedback to us. Jacobs is the engineer of record on this project. We have Dan Herstein as the project manager in the room with me. Catherine Burns is remote. She is the primary author of this report we're putting out. Amy Lahav is in Nevada. She is a technology specialist and she comes from the energy side rather than the transportation side. Most important questions we've been asking and you can ask is, what's Nevada doing? What's the other states doing on this same thing? Because all 50 states are going through the same process. Samantha Diaz is our scribe who's going to make sure that she captures all the conversations and notes that we want to capture. Somaya is a transportation planner and she's assisting us all on this report. And lastly, Alec Curley is an EV charging expert out of the Jacobs London office. What we've come to realize is London is about 5 years ahead of us on EV infrastructure deployment, and he's here to present business models and lessons learned from something that's a little further down the road. So with that, let's turn the camera off, pull up the PowerPoint, Dan, and let's begin.
Yes. On its way.
Okay. And by the way, for people who are in the DOT building, maybe Department of Administration, there's a problem right now with the network. So JP just came from a meeting that was ended early because of network issues, and we're hoping that we're as insulated from that as possible. So please bear with us. So our stakeholder outreach meeting, EV charging infrastructure, Dan, please. So what we're going to do is intersperse some of the questions from the meeting 2 weeks ago. First question we got is, are you looking for input on the type of project stakeholders would like to see, or just the process for gathering information going forward? We were asked an either or question and our response is yes. We're looking for both. we don't want this to just be a download of what these really talented engineers have come up with. The whole project is a 7-year project. The goal is to develop a nationwide infrastructure of these charging stations. We want to make sure that we maximize the benefits of this project. So we want your comments, we want your feedback, we want your questions, we want your ideas as we move forward. Next one, Dan. So kind of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a quick little project summary, cover some of the things we covered 2 weeks ago. Then we're going to talk about some of the design efforts and some of the things we're looking at as we put this together, maybe dig a little deeper into the thought process. Dan. So we began 2 weeks ago. We're going to continue it now with the 2021 Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, $548 billion in new spending. It was signed into law November 15th, 2021. It became the bipartisan infrastructure law. What we care about is $15 billion of that $548 billion is going for electric vehicles. Of that 15 billion, 7.5 is going towards these charger stations. The goal is 500,000 charger stations by 2030. A big task to undergo. Dan. And by the way, I missed one thing, but everybody who's reading knows Rhode Island's portion of that is 23 billion over the next 5 years. Million. No, 23 million over the next 5 years. Sorry. JP is good at getting funding, but there's certain limits. Anyways, talk a little bit about the NEVI program. $5 billion is the core amount that tunnels into the 23 million for Rhode Island. There's another $2.5 billion that there's more guidance coming out on, and the $2.5 billion are $1.25 billion programs. Corridor Charging Grant Program and the Community Charging Grant Program. The priorities of that are rural charging, climate change, resilient infrastructure, underserved, overbuilt communities. The most important takeaway from this slide is AFC build-outs. And Dan and JP, can you give the guys 15, 20-second, what is an AFC?
Yep, I could do that. The federal government previously has asked states to identify alternative fuel corridors. That's not just electric vehicles. There's also ones for propane or hydrogen or other technologies. But this program is focused on the electric vehicle alternative fuel corridors. In the past, there hasn't really been any funding. It's been more of an aspirational thought to build out something like the interstate based on the interstate system to allow people with these alternative fuel vehicles to be able to go on trips, go anywhere they need to want and be confident that they will be able to charge up or fuel up. The difference is now the NEVI program is actually providing funding. So it made sense for the federal government to say, okay, now that all the states have identified these AFCs, use this funding to build out those corridors to make sure there's sufficient charging infrastructure. We do anticipate that there will be future rounds of nominations for alternative fuel corridors during the course of this funding.
Great. So everything that RIDOT produces will be under this AFC corridor format. Dan? So 2 weeks ago, we talked about this great 500+ billion down to 23 million. One of the most significant questions we got that day was, what are the federal requirements state with respect to workforce development? The feds must have heard us because that afternoon they put out some additional guidance. Dan, let's go to the next slide. If you look at the June 6th guidance that came out, what is really coming through is this is really meant to expand the workforce to address Justice 40 initiatives, underserved communities. I have page 70 of the guidance. And there's a lot of good verbiage on the electricians. For an electrician to participate in this, they've got to have a certification, this electric vehicle infrastructure program. It's an online program. It's for existing electricians. It's a real intensive program, and it ends with a 90-minute proctored exam. Electricians working on this project have to pass that, or they have to be in a registered apprenticeship program and then have information on electric vehicle safety equipment, electric vehicle supply equipment, ESVE, and some training in that. There's another great requirement that says for projects requiring more than one electrician, at least one electrician must meet the requirements above, and at least one electrician must be enrolled in an electrical registered apprenticeship program. My read on this is the federal government is looking to expand the workforce of qualified electricians to keep these things operating, not just cannibalized from other industries. There's some additional verbiage, other on-site non-electrical workers have to be in an apprenticeship program, appropriate state licenses and that. So this is really not just to put a bunch of chargers all over the place. This is to train an industry workforce to maintain them. And I just read to you page 70 of the guidance. What's really interesting is page 38 of the guidance. The FHWA, in giving some background, said two things. One is they're requesting comments on how to best utilize the registered apprenticeship system to ensure qualified electricians have the training. Second, and they're looking for inputs from the states on this. Second, they're recommending, very strongly recommending, is my read, that states take proactive steps to work with training providers, workforce boards, labor unions, and other worker organizations, community-based organizations, nonprofits, to build a local workforce that will support the EV network. It talks about expanding existing programs. States are encouraged to support training pathways that are inclusive of women, Black, Latino, Asian American, Pacific, Indigenous, and other underrepresented groups. So in response to that question 2 weeks ago, this is not just putting a bunch of chargers up there. There's some very strong guidance from the feds on creating the personnel needed to install and maintain these things and expanding job opportunities. Okay. Real quick, here's kind of the NEVI core team. Two quick takeaways. When I began my engineering career 30, 40 years ago, if there was a project, they would send the engineers in a corner. Engineers would come out at the end and say, here's our design, we're done. That doesn't work anymore. This is RIDOT working with OER, working with DEM, working with this technical advisory committee. It's a 7-year project and it's a collaborative effort. It's high visibility, it's director level coordination. And Dan, before we go to the next slide, I think I got 2 questions here. And the first is from Shauna. Is there a state agency that will be tracking these licenses? Shauna, we don't have an answer for that. We just got the guidance 2 weeks ago. In our internal discussions, this is a tremendous opportunity. I'm confident that the core team, along with this process, is identifying someone that will track these licenses. The federal guidance also talks about data submissions, and it starts 680.112, but they talk about quarterly reports as well as annual data submittals. And part of the annual data submittals is Section D, community engagement outcome reports, where they have to report about some of these resources that are being applied. So the feds are asking for it. RIDOT and this project team, I think, are going to be supplying it. We haven't identified yet exactly what that mechanism is, but that's an integral part of this project. And I have another question from Hank. Are you coordinating efforts with the Power Sector Transformation Advisory Group, Electric Transportation Subcommittee, that has helped guide an EV charging infrastructure program over the past 4 years?
I'm not sure what authority does that meet under? I'm not sure. Is the Power Sector Transportation Advisory Group, is that part of a larger group?
Is it federal or is it Rhode
And
Island?
Hank, I think you got the ability to unmute.
Yes, sorry, had to figure it out. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
We can hear you, Hank.
Great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the Power Sector Transformation Advisory Group is something that's looking at broader issues of grid modernization, electrification, obviously, of not only heating, but obviously transportation. And so it's convened by Rhode Island Energy, which I see on the Technical Advisory Committee. But it also involves like the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers. It involves other agencies on this list, and it involves stakeholders from nonprofits like Acadia Center that help advise on things like making sure that these stations are located, you know, in a variety of different types of locations: public, private, workplace, multifamily, and it's overseen hundreds of installations or port installations of level 2 and level 3 DCFC charging. And it's, I think it's been a really successful collaboration, and that we learned a lot of lessons from that. So I just want to make sure that some of that, those lessons learned are kind of being fed into this, particularly from some of the stakeholders that, may predate Rhode Island Energy's folks. I'm not sure who specifically is working on the Technical Advisory Committee.
Yeah, no, so we have.
That's incredible. Go ahead, JP.
I was going to say we have.
Okay, well,
but we do have some you folks with us.
Okay.
yeah, so we are working with Office of Energy and the utility, but part of these stakeholder meetings is to learn who else needs to be engaged and what other stakeholder information we can glean. So we'll definitely expand the search. But bottom line, yes, we are working with the electricity sector, utilities, and the state agencies. There's more stakeholders to engage.
And Hank and Shauna, we had a similar thing arise yesterday where one stakeholder made us aware of something that wasn't on it. I said, this is good because this gets this up on the table. I'm going to ask both of you. The second last slide is the Rhode Island DOT web project website. Either go to that website and you can fill in, let us have your contact information so we can make sure that we can answer these questions for you, make sure that we don't miss any information. If you don't go to that slide, the last slide is JP's email address. So send them an email, but make sure we keep in contact with you. And anyone else on this call, that's why those two contact methods are there. Let us know what else should be up on the table. Let's go to the next slide, Dan. So August 1st, big deadline. We've got to submit this report about how we're going to be doing this deployment. It's not latitude and longitude. It's not explicit contracting method. It's not here are the requirements that we're designing into it. It's the process. I tell people it's like, when you play football, we're on the 10-yard line when we submit this report, but we're going to get it submitted. We're going to get the funding in place, and then we take it down the field. AFC corridors, which Dan talked about, public accessible, a mile from the highway, 50 miles max between stations. Let's go to the next one. This is what's going into the Rhode Island State EV infrastructure plan. The takeaway from this slide is things like Justice 40, labor and workforce are important parts of this plan. We're looking for your information to put it in. It's not a final Latin law, but this is what we're developing now. These stakeholder outreach meetings are part of this process. Dan? We're going to dig down into the weeds for just 1 minute, and then we're going to talk about the corridors. But for those of you saying, what's the stuff like? Upper top, you've got level 1 chargers. That's like when you plug in your hair dryer, you bring your car to your garage, you plug it into the outlet in your garage, kind of charges your car slowly overnight. Level 2 chargers, that's like your clothes dryer or your electric oven. It draws a lot more power. It's 240 volts. An electrician comes into your garage, puts one of these big boxes up there. You plug your car into the big box. It charges it much faster than just the level 1 charger. Level 3 chargers, that's what are going into these AFC corridor charging stations. 480 volts DC fast chargers. There's actually more powerful chargers available, but the feds, it looks like they're standardizing on, here's where the state of the practice is now. Here's the minimum for these 50,000 units that are going in. If you go down to the lower illustration, 100 miles is kind of becoming the standard of how people measure chargers, because cars are different, battery rates are different, whether you're mostly charged or completely empty. 100 miles of charge. And if you look at the 150 kilowatt charger, it's a level 3 charger. It says that if you pull up, connect it, you'll get 100 miles of charge in about 14 minutes. That's what the standard is. So 480 volt level 3 charger, 150 kilowatt charger. By the way, the high power chargers, you get into things like liquid cooling in the cables. So they're pretty powerful stuff. What we're designing to is the level 3, 150 kilowatts as a minimum. We can always go above that. I got a question here from Joshua. And this question is, the Rhode Island EV infrastructure plan speaks to the need for planning for freight truck EV charging stations as well. Will this NEVI process incorporate any potential future siting options for freight truck EV charging stations?
Nope. That's a great question, and it doesn't appear to be included in this round. However, one thing we've remained cognizant of through this process is that this is, the first iteration of where we're going with electrical vehicles in general. So this tranche here is specifically focused on building out the corridors for, what I would consider passenger travel. We have heard information that is leading us to believe there will be further introductions of funding for, school buses. And then I think freight is also the next consideration. So not specifically in this funding, but it is something that we are always keeping top of mind as we develop our plans.
And Joshua, I remember going over the June 6th FHWA guidance. There was some verbiage about freight trucking in that. I'm not going to torture people by trying to find it now while everyone's listening, but if you go on the RIDOT website at the end of this, we're going to have a more detailed explanation that answers your question. And again, we got it on the table, and that's the most important part of these stakeholder meetings. Okay. A whole bunch of details that are required for the funding. Open non-proprietary payment methods. You don't have to be a member of any BJ's wholesaler link to access this. Probably the most important one is the operating and maintenance of these chargers are 5 years. So the idea of just putting them in place and not paying any attention to them, and then they all go into disrepair, that's been thought of. And that gets into the Justice 40 initiative, and that gets into training and workforce in order to do it. So I'm real happy they put that 5-year requirement in. Dan? Stakeholder questions, and this is going to get into some of the corridor design. I-95, it's the first corridor slated for approval. Are there others? And Route 44, 6, 295, those are the ones near and dear to this questionnaires heart. Do you guys want to take a shot at this? And then we'll talk with Catherine about the I-95 corridor that we're submitting.
Yep, I can speak to this. So as I mentioned before, alternative fuel corridors for electric vehicles. Currently, we only have one that's identified, I-95. We did go through a process where we considered identifying additional corridors. We've talked to some of the other states. Some went ahead and identified more at this stage, and others said, well, maybe we'll wait for more guidance. What we decided to do here was hold off for a future nomination and make sure that we fully understood and built out the 95 corridor first. We did consider routes, certainly 295 listed here, the US routes 6 and 44, and those would be our top priorities for future nomination rounds, which we do expect. We've been told that within the 5-year timeline of this NEVI funding, there will be opportunities to identify additional corridors, and that's certainly the first place we would look.
Great. Catherine, I'm going to ask you to take over and talk about the I-95 corridor. That's the one that's being submitted in this August 1st report.
Sure. Thanks, John. So like you were saying, RIDOT's AFC, our alternative fuel corridor, right now designated as Interstate 95. There is currently some signage along this interstate. If you travel there daily, you may have seen that in the past few years. As you know, this is a critical roadway for us, and the NEVI formula program funding cannot be used outside of this corridor until the Secretary of Transportation certifies that 95 is built out to their requirements after that first year. And on this map, you'll see a few existing stations, including a car dealership, Walmart, DOT park and ride facilities, 2 of those in Tesla. So there are 8 fast chargers at that Tesla location. Those are proprietary. And we're looking at non-proprietary charging. That existing Walmart location does have 4 chargers. It's also, if we want to click forward, Dan. Thanks. So looking at this existing station, and again, that federal guidance that it needs to be within 1 mile of the roadway, at least every 50 miles with a minimum of 4 high-powered 150-watt chargers. This existing Electrify America station meets those requirements. It's 5 miles from Massachusetts and 39 miles from the Connecticut border. And it has those chargers. This station is also located in a Justice 40 community, as has been designated by the DOT and DOE. So this is kind of a sample of those actual high-powered chargers based on a site visit that we did out to that location. So you can see this here. Like we said, it's owned by Electrify America, and all those stations actually meet the NEVI requirements. We can move on to the next one. So after the Secretary of Transportation approves and certifies that Interstate 95 is fully built out per federal requirements, we can then use the funding in the following years beyond Interstate 95. And our plan is to evaluate these new EV sites and existing site upgrades in a data-driven and collaborative process so that we deliver the highest benefit to the public. We want to share that with stakeholders and the public now as we get started and we're developing the plan on how we judge the impact of those benefits and really invite feedback. The table on this slide is kind of a sample, the sample site names at the top, like example Route 1, example Route 2. And there's a lot of national data sets and local resources that have been developed that can help us in this ranking process. And then in the end, we want to be able to clearly and concisely illustrate those and communicate them back to the readers of the document and to the public. So thinking like consumer reports type charts, an icon summary for that qualitative assessment that can help us kind of easily see the difference between low, medium, and high impacts based on those areas. And per the federal and national guidance, these are some of the areas we've been focusing in. For example, the traffic volume is critical. The distance, the traffic volume, more vehicles, more charging. the distance between publicly available EV charging currently in that local access, connections to the electrical grid and reliability, proximity to like small businesses, restrooms, seasonal attractions, and other amenities. The need for EV charging in rural areas and Justice 40 communities, and how do we kind of target the underserved and disadvantaged areas, the long-term operations and maintenance, workforce development, and some other factors, including protection, cybersecurity, environmental permitting came up yesterday, as John was saying, another consideration. And based on our previous stakeholder feedback and current guidance from focusing on the National Highway Network, the roadways on the left in the map kind of summarize the major and critical thoroughfares that are not Interstate 95. And again, we're presenting this today for feedback and response and people to participate. So that could be in one area or more. If that's EV workforce development, if a person or a group wants to get more involved or learn more about that, or something even like we were saying, that kind of power sector kind of communication. So inviting that feedback, we want to know, we want to hear if we're missing anything that's kind of unique to identify the impacts to Rhode Island to move forward. Thanks, John. I think you can move to the next slide and I'll hand it back.
Right. So two of the main questions that we got from the first stakeholder group was on procurement in that. It's the $7.5 billion question. Alec from the UK is going to be addressing this in that. Two questions are, does RIDOT envision owning and operating each of these stations or a subset, third-party agreements? Question, will the state be looking to partner with one charging station provider or all stations or multiple brands, manufacturers in that? The short answer is, sitting here on the 10-yard line, we haven't specified to that level. Alec is going to come in now and talk about some of the considerations that we are considering as we move this forward. Different models, different benefits, different liabilities. Alec.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the screen at the moment, what we've got here is just some of the traditional ways and sort of delivery and procurement models that we've seen adopted around other parts of the globe. Predominantly, we've seen a lot of these approaches in European markets, as it's been mentioned, are slightly further ahead in their journey towards electrification, which is obviously being driven by sort of greater government crackdown in terms of I suppose the end of petrol and diesel sales. So it's focused a few minds around this. And what we've seen is more and more of these types of models come to market. And really what's been able to look at is how they operate, some of the lessons learned, and how we start to learn from them in terms of shaping future rollouts and future delivery models. I think the one thing to say is that there's no right or wrong way of doing this to some extent. I think what I would say is it's all about picking a way and a mechanism which best fits with local needs and local objectives. I think the one takeaway that I've certainly taken from my involvement in electric vehicle rollout is it's got to be a collaborative partnership approach. So I think what I mean by that is RIDOT working with organisations and stakeholders like yourselves and really looking at, okay, what best suits our local needs and objectives, and then taking that decision from there. So I think the other thing as well to remember is the engagement with the private sector. So what I mean by the private sector is the charge point operators themselves, to talk to them about, well, okay, what are they looking to commit to hit this? How might they operate? What kind of deals and different delivery models can they work up with yourselves? And then also you've got the added advantage there in that they will also look to probably invest long term into the infrastructure as well. So it means that you get to roll infrastructure out at a greater pace and also adopt greater innovation. So you not only have the NEVI funding, but you also can supplement that with wider investment from the private sector. But again, these are all things that need to be worked through. I think what I would say as well, I think the decision around this is largely driven by, I suppose, the delivery agent's appetite for risk. And what I mean by that is, you know, how much risk they want to take from a financial perspective. So the more risk that you take, potentially the greater return on investment. And what I mean by it's basically collecting revenues from the charging post, and then that's giving you greater flexibility in terms of what you do with that. In terms of like how quickly you roll that out. Do you reinvest it? Do you invest into new sites? Also in terms of operational and reputational. So again, you take on the infrastructure. Again, you are responsible for that infrastructure, so you'll have to maintain it, and you'll have to make sure that it's functional and is really meeting and catering for local requirements. Obviously, that if you want to take a step back from that, again, you leave that to the private sector, and through a contractual arrangement, then you know they're on the hook for that. So you will tie them into a contract to say, well, this is what we expect from our network at the very minimum, and these are the sort of stipulations and clauses that we'll install into that contract to make sure that you're delivering what we need long term. So in terms of what you've got on the screen, sort of broadly broken these down to 3 separate areas. So the in-house management is really, and in this case would be RIDOT taking a lot more ownership of the network. So they can either, as we do that on their own in terms of employ staff to install infrastructure and run the back office functions, maintain and deliver, or you can, the other alternative is also to work with an external operator as well. But it's very much about having a more hands-on approach and being very prescriptive in terms of how you roll the infrastructure out, the innovation you'd expect to see, and the KPIs, and really driving a lot of that. Now, I know some of that is obviously set through the NEVI guidance, but adopting this does give you a little bit more flexibility, and organisations like this because it just gives them greater control over what they do, and they believe that they can meet their local objectives in a more sustained and a more efficient way if they have greater control. At the other end of that, you've got the commercially led approach, and really what that effectively entails is only stepping away to some extent and leaving it to the commercial sector to deliver. Now, it doesn't. This approach doesn't necessarily apply in the case of the NEVI and these corridors themselves, because the guides are very prescriptive in terms of what's expected in terms of the infrastructure and the location and the siting of those infrastructure. Really, commercially led is probably more around when you're starting to deliver into urban centres or rural areas, and what you're looking at there is saying to the commercial sector, you know, if you want to come in and you want to deliver infrastructure, we will leave that to you to do that. It completely minimises the risk on the public sector organisations. The only downside with that is obviously you have a commercial network, you know, you have a commercial operator on board, you know, you will get a commercial network, and that doesn't always appease local objectives. So you'll tend to find they'll invest into the most sort of prime areas, most affluent areas, and you can tend to find that some of the less some of the more deprived, and so those areas that can get left behind. So that's not always sort of politically acceptable, if you like. So again, I think there's really a balancing act to be done here, and that's where you see that second role, which is the concession partnership, and that's more about how you start to use public money and private money and wrapping that together to ensure that you enter into a partnership, probably with a charge point operator, and how you deliver a network that caters for everyone. So again, you're leaving the commercial operators to come in and hopefully support in terms of delivering those sites that you really want to deliver, but then you're also ensuring that you're using maybe government or public money to help backfill into those locations which maybe aren't as commercially viable, or maybe don't generate a greater return in terms of sort of sales or revenue that you'd expect. So I think it's about creating a bit more of a balanced approach to that, and just trying to use both public and private, wrapping it together, and trying to just use that to roll out a network in a sustained way, but also protecting that network and just making sure that it's it's delivering, it delivers for all effectively. So they're traditionally the approach that you've seen. There's no you can mix and match on some of these. You can tailor this to however you want to some extent. I think if you're going to sorry. Oh, sorry, I thought I had a question then. Sorry. So I think again, I think that's just something that's got to be worked through, and yeah, I think moving forward, this just gives you a bit of a breakdown of sort of an idea of sort of those models that are available at the moment and that are being looked at. So I don't know if there's any questions on that.
Then let's go to the next slide, because that's an introduction. Guys, we want this to be two-way. We want to know your questions. We want to know your concerns. 30-second diversion. Had a friend, Heather, she worked in 1985 for the US Embassy in East Berlin. Back when the Soviet Union still was in business, she lived in East Berlin, which meant her apartment was bugged, which means that she had a direct line to the Kremlin, which means that if her dishwasher wasn't working, she'd just walk into the dining room, look at the chandelier and say, my dishwasher still isn't working. If you don't fix it by Monday, I'm going to lodge a complaint, and they'd fix it over the weekend. We have JP here. This is a project that has director level involvement. JP is our direct line to the director. We've gotten some good stuff about freight that we want to include and make the powers that be aware. What else should we be telling JP to make sure that the powers that be are aware? And if people are formulating it, Brian had a comment that we want to address. Suggests that power and electric line load capabilities be used as a factor for site host selection. JP?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. It's a really good point. We have begun some of that work with our friends at the grid. It's kind of a double-edged sword because, as you can imagine, a lot of places that would look good for EV charging are actually at a high load as it stands right now. We certainly wouldn't want it to be a limiting factor. However, it certainly is a factor we need to consider if we can perhaps get more bang for our buck from the federal dollars if we don't have to invest a ton to increase capacity in one location. So certainly an excellent point, certainly something we are monitoring, working closely with our friends at Rhode Island Energy, and something we have to take a look at.
Great. Other questions? Anyone want to unmute? Anyone want to type anything into the chat? All right, let's go to the last slide, which talks about we're going to have additional involvement. I think we're scheduling a July 14th final stakeholder meeting to really kind of show you where we are in the process. August 1st is a hard deadline right now, so we have to always be aware of that. The RIDOT webpage, we're doing this as an open book format. You'll have emails you can sign up for. You can submit questions and answers. Copies of everything we've done will be there. The most important thing is the last bullet, project documents. The Justice 40 webinar is happening tomorrow. There's a link on the webpage. You can go to it and sign up for the Justice 40 webinar. We'll see some of you hopefully on July 14th. We want to thank you for your input. If there's anything you think of that you wish you would have asked or wanted to make us aware of, the RIDOT website is going to be the point of coordination. Thank you all for coming.
Yep, we'll keep the line open just for a few minutes if anyone wants to unmute, or we'll continue looking at the chat. But thank you all for attending.
Yeah. It's